I want to talk with you about ways that you can maximize the distance that you get out of your archery gear, because regardless of the speed that you're shooting, there's other factors that come into play with how much distance you can get out of that bow. So one of the things is going to be your sight distance, your sight to peep distance. Another one's going to be your peep height. Then we're also going to talk about the arrows that you choose and how speed affects it, and then also your pin and your aperture choice and how clearance also factors into getting the most out of your bow. Because sometimes people that go to the tack for the first time, they aren't able to shoot some of those further distances and they're wondering why. So let's go into detail. First and foremost, I want to talk with you about something that instantly affects your sight scale. So if you have a bow that's shooting 280 feet per second, even if that speed is constant, if you change the relationship of that front sight to the rear sight, the more you stretch that out, the bigger your pin gaps will be. Now in target archery, that has a very unique purpose because the archers are aiming at super fine details and they're also super precise on the yardage. So having a bigger scale lets you micro adjust your height. Now this gets important when you're shooting at the longer distances, especially when you get into the triple distances, because a half a yard is noticeable in inches if you're good enough to shoot that way. So for me personally, I've found a happy medium, and the sights that I shoot on my bow, if you notice, are fairly close to the riser. I like that because it lets me shoot a smaller pin gap and it keeps my pins closer together. Now if you have a bunch of pins, sometimes at the closer distances you might have a little bit more clutter, but the fact that they are closer together then allows you to have more space at the bottom range of that scale. Because what ends up happening is once you move this front sight down far enough, it starts to contact the arrow. So that's really your limitation, is how far you can move that sight down, which inadvertently allows you to aim up for the cast of that arrow. But if you run out of space to where that arrow is interfering with the front sight, well then that's going to be your maximum yardage. So sights that have a dovetail feature, again, if I was shooting 280 feet per second, a scale I could have right here in the middle, that would work. But if I decided to extend this sight out further in front of my bow, I would need to have a scale that is longer. So in other words, even though my speed's the same, if I decided to put this all the way out front like that, so I would have that micro adjustability in my yardage, what would take away would be the fact that now, because I need a bigger scale, this sight is going to get encroaching on that arrow much faster. Now if I brought the sight closer to the bow, even though the speed's the same, I'll then be able to get my pins tighter together and I'll be able to shoot what appears to be a faster scale. It's really the scale and not necessarily the speed. Now the other thing, some sights have a dovetail, and even if you brought them close all the way up, there's another factor I'll talk a little bit more about later, but that's going to be the distance between your pin and the bottom of that housing. Because again, what's going to cause you to have to stop at how far you're able to shoot is when that scope gets too close to the arrow. So having an aperture where the single aiming device is at a further distance from the bottom of that means you're going to contact it first before you actually get that pin closer to the arrow shaft. Now the next thing that I want to talk about is peep height. So your peep height also factors into how much or how little of distance you can get out of your current setup. The closer this peep is to that arrow shaft, the closer your sight is naturally going to have to be to the arrow shaft as a start as well. So what that means is if you're a person who anchors higher up on the face, then your peep height is going to be pretty small. And when your peep height is very close to the arrow, you're going to have to get your sight very close to that arrow too, which means once you start getting to the further distances, your sight is going to run into that arrow sooner. So if you're a wrist strap shooter, for example, and you're someone who likes to, put your thumb up here, closer to your ear, or you're anchoring a little bit higher, especially if you're a person that used to shoot trad archery and you're used to drawing that arrow up closer and you're looking down the arrow shaft, well, once you have a peep in your bow, if that becomes too close together, you're going to limit how far you can move your sight down in order to achieve those distances. So honestly, certain releases could allow you to get more distance because your anchor position might be a little bit lower, and it's going to put that arrow and the peep at a further distance, which automatically lets your scale or your top pin start higher up on the range. So then it gives you more range down. So peep height, definitely something that impacts it. If you're a female, if you're a youth, and the natural distance between your eye and where that arrow would be is very small, then you're naturally going to have less ability for those longer distances unless your anchor is very low, which would allow you to bring your peep up high. But you have to be careful. An anchor that's too low is going to start to put the arrow in a position on your chin that's going to have some interference with clearance, so your accuracy could go down. Now the next thing is going to be your speed and your arrow choice, because the heavier the arrow, the more that arrow is going to cast, the more it's going to slow down at those longer distances, and it's going to start to fall off faster. So there's different arrow options. So if you've noticed, when I go to a Total Archery Challenge event where some of the targets are in the triple digits, I'm not shooting my full metal jacket that I might hunt with for large game. I'm actually changing down to two other arrows, either a Sonic KE, which is a very light shaft, and I have a lot of options for the type of point weight I need. I don't really have to worry about overall arrow weight because I'm only penetrating targets, not penetrating animals. If I had the animal as a factor, then certainly I would have to make an adjustment for that. But if you're going to a target archery event, then picking an arrow that's slightly lighter so that you can have more speed is going to mean that your scale to begin with is going to be tighter because the arrow is faster and it's shooting a flatter trajectory. Now the other thing to factor in is the type of fletching that you have on that arrow. So if you notice, when I go to tack events, I go down to a smaller vane. Now this is for two reasons. One, the smaller vane means less drag, so it's going to slow down at a slower rate than if this had more surface area and where it would start to slow down quicker at those longer distances. Because I'm not steering a broadhead on the front of a target arrow, these smaller vanes work perfectly well with the field point, but they also have less drag, so the arrow is able to maintain some of that speed at the longer distance, which also helps me maintain a tighter scale, meaning I can get my sight even further down to my arrow for those longer yardages. Now the last thing that this helps is it also helps with the amount of clearance you'll have, because the bigger your fletching, then the more likely that fletching is to contact that housing. So your fletching type, if it is a high profile vane, so if you're shooting a short, high profile vane, then that vane is more likely to contact that front housing. Now to elaborate a little more on the front housing, what you have to think about is the overall size of your front sight. The bigger the sight, the closer the sight is already going to be to the point of that arrow. And once you get to where you're out of clearance, you're out of yardage, you're out of space. So if you choose a really big housing, if you choose an oblong housing, those are all going to limit the amount of yardage that you have. Now, one of the things that we include, like with our NE sight, so our Spot Hogg NE sight is one that I love because it has a short extension bar. So I'm bringing that a little closer. My pin gaps are going to be tighter. I'm going to be able to get more distance, but I can also change out this aperture for a smaller aperture that it comes with. And so now I'm able, at 100 yards, the distance between that and that is probably 3 to 4 yards. It doesn't seem like a lot, but at the longer distances and you're worried about this scope getting as close as possible to your arrow so you can maximize your length out of your bow, then having that clearance is important. The other thing is, if you set up your multi-pin sight to where your pins are stopping with your last pin way up above that level, then that means all that other space is wasted space. And honestly, some of that space could equal as much as 10 yards for some people. So what I do, if I'm ever wanting a bow that's going to maximize my distance out of a fixed pin sight, is the first pin I'll actually adjust is the bottom pin. I'll bring it as close to that bottom level as I can to where I would still be able to have a nice sight picture and still be able to see the target above that level. But I start with that pin and I'll get my 60 first and then I'll sight in backwards. And what that means is my 20-yard pin might not be up here at the top of this housing. It might start closer to the center, but then my bottom pin is closer to my bubble, meaning I'm wasting less space between the bottom of my housing and that last pin. And again, some sites that have a long pin and there's a lot of wasted space, then what you could do is you could either put a small aiming dot on the top of your level, or you could even put a small white dot of paint on that pin lower down so that you're able to get some extra yardage. But those are the things that factor in. Your sight length, how far that is, the further it is away, the bigger your pin gap is going to be. Okay, peep height. Your starting peep height and the distance between that peep and that arrow shaft at full draw is going to automatically determine where your first pin is going to start. And if you're starting really low, already close to the arrow, that means you're going to run out of space really, really fast. Remember, speed for sure a factor, but not just the speed, also the type of fletching you choose and what that fletching offers you for clearance on your sight, and then obviously the type of sight that you can go with, and picking one that gets that bottom aiming pin closer to that level and starting with your bottom pin on your multi-pin sights closer to the level to begin with during your sight-in process, and then coming close to the target. Those are all going to be things that get you the most yardage out of your bow.